In the sprawling, restless city of Las Vegas lived a young woman named Aria Reynolds. To the wealthy patrons of the Blackwell estate she served and the hurried crowd she navigated on her rare days off, she was nearly invisible, just another nanny caring for someone else's child, just another shadow folding laundry in a house that would never be hers. She poured juice for little Emma Blackwell at breakfast while the family talked over her. Orange juice, always pulp-free, always in the crystal glass that cost more than her weekly salary. Emma was 7 years old, with golden curls and a voice that rang like bells through the marble hallway. When Emma asked questions, "Miss Aria, why do you live in the small room?" Evelyn Blackwell would smile, that thin smile, and redirect her daughter's attention to something else. Anything else. Anywhere but toward the woman serving the food. The Blackwell house was a fortress of white and glass perched in the hills above the city. 20 rooms. Aria occupied one converted closet on the 3rd floor with a narrow cot and a single window the size of a book. At night, lying on that cot, she could see the neon signs of downtown Las Vegas bleeding through the darkness like a disease spreading across the sky. 14 hours a day, she moved through that house. Waking Emma at 6:16 in the morning. Braiding her hair. Packing her lunch. Driving her to private school in the black Mercedes that Aria was permitted to use only for that purpose. Then home to fold laundry that smelled of fabric softener and wealth. Cooking dinner she would not eat. Cleaning dishes she had not dirted. Reading bedtime stories in a voice so quiet it was almost an apology. The Blackwells rarely looked at her. She had learned to move like a ghost, faithful and invisible. Her clothes hung from a single wire in that closet. 3 work dresses, all black. 2 pairs of shoes, both worn through at the heel. The fabric of her life was threadbare and careful. At night, after Emma slept, Aria sat on her cot and counted. Always counting. The mathematics of survival had become her only language. $5 in her pocket. That was what remained. $5 between now and a catastrophe that was no longer theoretical. It was real. It had a deadline written in red ink. The eviction notice had arrived 8 days ago. She kept it hidden under her pillow, folded into quarters, a piece of paper that weighed like a stone. 12 days remaining. Then she would have nowhere to live except the small studio apartment she could no longer afford, the apartment where her mother lay in a hospital bed 3 miles away, fighting a disease that was eating her alive from the inside out. $35,000. That was the number that haunted her. The surgery. The treatment. The only thing that stood between her mother's life and a funeral Aria could not afford to pay for. $35,000, and she had worked for the Blackwells for 4 years on a salary that amounted to barely $30,000 per year after taxes, after her studio apartment rent, after the medical bills that kept multiplying like a curse she could not escape. Her mother's name was Rosa. She had raised Aria alone after her father left them when Aria was 3 years old. Rosa had worked 2 jobs. Sometimes 3. She had cleaned houses, washed dishes, scrubbed floors until her hands became red and cracked and permanent. Everything Rosa had done, she had done for Aria. Now Aria was supposed to do the same. Now Aria was supposed to save her. But there was no time left. The surgery had to happen in 3 days. 3 days. After that, the doctors said, the window would close. The cancer would spread beyond what they could reach. 3 days, and her mother would become a name on a death certificate, and Aria would become a woman who had everything taken from her and could do nothing but watch it disappear. She pulled out her phone, a cheap device, prepaid, the screen cracked across one corner, and scrolled through her bank account. $217. Not enough. Not even close. She had borrowed $5,000 from a man named Douglas Hale, a man who moved through the city like a predator in an expensive suit. The interest was climbing. Each day, the debt grew. Soon it would be more than $35,000. Soon it would be impossible. Douglas Hale had a way of making impossible things happen. Just not in ways that led to happiness. The wind moved through Las Vegas that night like a blade wrapped in ice. It shook the Blackwell house. It rattled the windows. It found its way through the tiny window of Aria's closet room and carried with it the smell of rain coming, though no rain had fallen in Las Vegas for 43 days. The desert was thirsty. Everything was thirsty. Aria lay on her cot and listened to the wind and thought about her mother's hands. Rosa's hands had wrinkles now, deep canyons of wrinkles, and age spots like shadows. Those hands had braided Aria's hair every morning before school. Those hands had held her when she cried. Those hands had worked and worked and worked until they could work no longer. In 3 days, those hands might stop working altogether. Aria did not cry. Her tears had dried up somewhere on a Greyhound bus when she was 19 years old, traveling to Las Vegas for a job that promised stability and delivered only slow suffocation. She closed her eyes instead and tried to imagine a future where her mother was still alive, still breathing, still fighting. But the number kept returning. $35,000. The clock on her phone read 11:43 in the evening. The Blackwell house had gone quiet. Completely quiet. The way houses go quiet when everyone inside them is asleep, dreaming their untouched dreams, safe in their rooms with their certainties. Aria lay in her closet and held the $5 bill in her hand. She rubbed it between her fingers like it was a prayer, like it was something sacred. $5. It was everything. It was nothing. It was the exact distance between one day and the next, and no more. And in 3 days, everything she had left would disappear. The rain finally came just before dawn. Not gentle rain. Violent rain. It hammered against her small window like something trying to break through. Aria listened to it and waited for morning to arrive. She waited for another day of invisibility. Another day of counting. Another day of being a shadow in a house full of light. What she did not know, what she could not have known as she lay in her narrow cot listening to the rain, was that 3 miles away, in a private hospital room on the 5th floor of St. Mary's Medical Center, her mother was asking for her. Asking the nurses if Aria was coming. Asking if there was enough time left. And what she did not know, as the rain fell harder and the wind shook the Blackwell house, was that in exactly 47 hours, a black convoy of vehicles would arrive at the corner of Madison and 5th. That men in dark suits would step out onto the wet pavement. That everything invisible about her life was about to become impossibly visible. That everything was about to change. The morning came like it always came. Grey. Ordinary. Full of the small duties that comprised Aria's existence. She rose at 5:24 in the morning, showered in the small bathroom on the 3rd floor before anyone else woke, changed into her black dress, and descended to the kitchen. Emma was always the first to wake after Aria. The girl padded down the marble staircase in her slippers, her hair disheveled, rubbing her eyes with the backs of her small fists. "Good morning, Miss Aria," Emma said, the way children do when they have been taught politeness more than affection. "Good morning, Emma," Aria replied. Her voice was steady. It never shook. "Did you sleep well?" "I had a dream about a horse," Emma said. She climbed onto the high chair at the kitchen island. It was brown. And it could talk. Aria poured the orange juice. Pulp-free. The crystal glass. "What did the horse say?" "It said that sad things don't last forever," Emma said. She took a sip of juice. "Do you think that's true, Miss Aria?" Aria froze for a moment. Just a moment. Her hand went still. Then she continued preparing breakfast, because that was what she did. She moved forward. She continued. "I think that's a very wise horse," Aria said quietly. Evelyn Blackwell entered the kitchen at 7:12 in the morning. She was a woman of 53 years old but looked younger, the kind of young that comes from expensive creams and dermatologists and a life where nothing had ever truly touched her. Her hair was blonde. Her clothes were immaculate. Her expression was the one she always wore, a smile that did not involve her eyes. "Aria," Evelyn said. Not good morning. Just to Aria. Like she was calling a dog. "I need you to take Emma to school early today." I have a spa appointment at 9. Of course, Aria said. And when you return, Evelyn continued, not looking at her, you'll need to reorganize the linen closet. The way you've been organizing it is completely inadequate. Aria nodded. She did not point out that she had organized the linen closet exactly 1 week ago. She did not point out that the organizational system was not something that could become inadequate in 7 days. She simply nodded and said, yes, Mrs. Blackwell. This was what invisible women did. They agreed. They moved. They continued. The drive to school was quiet except for Emma singing something to herself about horses and dreams. The rain had stopped. The sky above Las Vegas was that particular shade of gray that meant the weather might change but probably would not. The city looked smaller in daylight. Less like a glittering fortress and more like a mistake people had built in the wrong place. When Aria returned to the Blackwell house at 8:24 in the morning, the front gate was open. This was unusual. The gate was always closed. Always guarded. The Blackwells did not have guards exactly, but they had security. They had gates. They had a way of keeping the outside world outside. Today the gate was open. Aria pulled the black Mercedes into the driveway and noticed immediately that something was wrong. There was a car parked there that did not belong. A black SUV. German. Expensive. The kind of vehicle that suggested power or danger or both. She parked the Mercedes and turned off the engine and sat very still. The front door of the Blackwell house opened. 2 men stepped out. Tall men. Both wearing dark suits that fit them perfectly, the kind of suits that cost more than Aria's entire annual salary. One of them had a scar running from his left eye to his cheekbone, thin and white and precise. The other had the kind of face that suggested he had seen things that most people were not meant to see. They walked down the steps toward Aria's car. She sat frozen. She did not move. She did not know what protocol was for this. For men like these appearing at the Blackwell house at 8:36 in the morning. The man with the scar reached her window. He gestured for her to roll it down. She did. Miss Aria Reynolds, he said. Not a question. A statement. His voice was not loud, but it carried the weight of someone who was accustomed to being heard. Yes, she whispered. Come with us. And that was when Aria Reynolds understood that her invisibility had ended. The marble floor of the Blackwell house gleamed like a mirror reflecting a life that was not hers. Aria Reynolds stood in the grand foyer at 8:48 in the morning, still wearing the stained uniform from her night shift at the diner, her hands trembling as they rested at her sides. The crystal chandelier overhead cast fractured light across the space, and that light fell on Evelyn Blackwell, who stood in the center of the room holding a diamond bracelet between her thumb and forefinger as if it were evidence in a trial. Which, Aria understood in that moment, it was. This bracelet was in her room, Evelyn said, her voice cutting through the air like a blade. I found it myself in the nanny's closet. Tucked behind the winter coats where she thought no one would look. Aria's mouth went dry. She had not taken the bracelet. She knew this with absolute certainty because she knew everything she had never taken, and the list was long. She had never taken the silver candlesticks from the dining room. She had never taken the pearl earrings left on Mrs. Blackwell's vanity. She had never taken anything that did not belong to her, which meant she owned almost nothing, which meant she had been invisible for so long that the accusation felt like a blade cutting through the only solid thing she had left, her character. Mrs. Blackwell, I would never, Aria began, but Evelyn held up one hand. Liar, Evelyn said simply. The word hung in the foyer like a bell that could not be unrung. Around them, the household staff stood in a nervous line near the kitchen entrance. Maria the cook. Thomas the gardener. Jennifer who handled the laundry. All of them watching. All of them silently calculating whether to believe the woman in the designer suit or the exhausted girl in the uniform that bore the sweat stains of a double shift. Mr. Blackwell stood near the grand staircase, his face growing pale. He was a man built for comfort, not conflict. His suit was expensive and his hands were soft, and his eyes moved between his wife and the nanny with the expression of someone hoping the problem would resolve itself if he simply refused to engage with it. "I want her arrested," Evelyn continued, her voice steady and certain. "I'm calling the police right now. A thief living under our roof, in the same house where my stepdaughter sleeps. Where Emma sleeps." She glanced toward the hallway where 6-year-old Emma Blackwell stood clutching a stuffed rabbit, her small face crumpling as she watched the adults around her collapse into accusation and denial. The child had been coming down the stairs when this began, and now she could not look away, the way children cannot look away from disasters happening in slow motion. Aria's hand shook. She reached into her pocket to pull out her own belongings, to prove somehow through the poverty of her possessions that she had stolen nothing, when the eviction notice fell from her apron and floated to the marble floor like a confession written in red ink. Evelyn was faster than a snake. She bent and seized the paper before Aria could move. Her eyes scanned it. The address. The amount. The deadline marked in thick red letters, 12 days. Desperate, Evelyn whispered, and then louder, for the benefit of the staff, for the benefit of Mr. Blackwell, who finally looked at Aria with something that might have been pity or might have been doubt. $35,000. 12 days until she's homeless. That's motive, isn't it? A woman with nothing to lose will steal anything. Emma made a sound then, a small cry like a wounded animal, because she understood at 6 years old what the adults in the room were doing. They were erasing someone. They were taking away the only person in this house who braided her hair without impatience, who sat with her during thunderstorms, who had never once raised her voice in anger. Aria did not cry. Her tears had dried up somewhere on the Greyhound bus that brought her to Las Vegas 3 years ago. Instead, she stood very still and waited for the next thing to happen, because something was about to happen. She could feel it the way animals feel earthquakes before the earth moves. The foyer door opened. A man stepped through it, and the temperature in the room changed. Aleandro Caruso was 6 feet 3 inches tall with shoulders broad enough to carry the weight of things that could destroy other men. His suit was Italian, tailored, the color of midnight, and beneath it his white shirt was open at the collar, revealing a chest marked by one thin scar that ran like a lightning strike from collarbone to ribs. His dark eyes were the color of storm clouds, and when those eyes moved across the foyer, they saw everything: the accusation, the trembling nanny, the cruel stepmother, the failed patriarch, the suffering child. Behind him stood 2 men. Bruno, broad-shouldered and scarred, and Luca, who had the kind of face that suggested he had killed people and would do it again without hesitation. "Who are you?" Evelyn demanded, snapping into the voice she used for household staff and people she considered beneath her. "This is a private family matter." Mr. Blackwell went the color of old paper. "Mr. Caruso, I apologize for this domestic situation. I had no idea." But Aleandro Caruso was already walking across the marble floor toward Aria. His footsteps echoed in the silence, measured and deliberate, each step the sound of something inevitable arriving. He stopped in front of her, and his eyes held hers for 5 seconds that felt like centuries. "Did you take the bracelet?" His voice was quiet. Not loud. But it carried the weight of a man accustomed to being obeyed, the weight of someone who had learned early that whispers could break bones better than screams. Aria lifted her chin. She was exhausted. She was terrified. She was standing on the edge of homelessness with $5 in her other pocket. But she was not a liar. "No, sir," she said, and her voice did not shake. "I didn't." Aleandro studied her for 5 more seconds. Then he turned to face Evelyn, and something in his expression made her step backward. "Check the security cameras," he said to Mr. Blackwell. "Review them. You'll find the bracelet exactly where this woman placed it." He did not look at Evelyn as he spoke, but everyone in the room understood he was speaking to her, about her, with a certainty that left no room for doubt. Or perhaps you're aware that tampering with household staff is a form of fraud that carries legal consequences even in Nevada. The word legal hung in the air like a weapon. Evelyn's face flickered. Something in her expression broke and reformed. She understood in that moment that she had misjudged her audience. She had expected a frightened nanny and a passive husband. Instead, she had invited something into the room that she could not control. Mr. Blackwell began to speak, his voice shaking. "There's been a misunderstanding, I'm sure. Mr. Caruso, we appreciate your concern, but this is really a family." Aria removed her apron. She folded it carefully and placed it into Evelyn's hands. The gesture was small, but it was absolute. It was a closing of a door. It was a refusal to remain in a room where her character was being dismantled by someone who had never worked a day in her life. "I quit," Aria said, and the words felt like freedom and devastation in equal measure. She walked past them all. Past the stepmother who would have destroyed her. Past the patriarch who had chosen silence. Past the two men in suits who carried violence in their posture. She did not look at Aleandro Caruso, though she felt his eyes follow her all the way to the door. She did not look back when Emma screamed her name, a sound of such pure abandonment that it nearly broke her. The Las Vegas heat hit her like a fist when she stepped outside. The sun was merciless at 9 in the morning, and the sidewalk burned through her thin shoes. She had nowhere to go. She had $5 in her pocket. She had 12 days before the eviction notice became a reality. She had $35,000 to find somewhere in a city that had already shown her every way it could break a person who had nothing to offer but her labor. Behind her, inside the marble foyer, Aleandro Caruso watched her disappear into the heat and light, and something shifted in his chest. The men around him saw it. Bruno and Luca exchanged a look that suggested they understood something had changed in their boss in that single moment. Something quiet and dangerous and irreversible. What Aria did not know, as she walked down the sidewalk counting her $5 like it was a prayer, was that Aleandro Caruso had spent the last 15 years forgetting how to see people. He had spent 15 years behind walls and men in suits and the weight of an empire built on fear. But he had just watched a woman with nothing stand in front of a room full of cruelty and keep her truth intact. He had watched her choose dignity over survival. And he never forgot a face that held that much courage. The rain came down like a blade wrapped in ice, and Aria Reynolds stood on the shoulder of the highway with blood running from her palms, her cheap shoes falling apart, her $5 the only thing between her and absolute nothing. The storm had turned the afternoon black. Lightning split the sky in jagged white lines. Cars screamed past, their headlights cutting through the downpour, and each one sprayed muddy water across her soaked clothes and shattered face. She had twisted her ankle when she fell. It throbbed with a dull, sick pain that made standing impossible. So she sat on the wet gravel, knees pulled to her chest, and let the rain soak through the thin fabric of her second-hand blouse. 12 days. That was all she had left before the eviction notice became real, before the locks changed, before she had nowhere at all to sleep. And she had just lost the only job she had. The bus had broken down 3 miles outside the city. The driver had told everyone to wait for the next one in 2 hours. Other passengers had called Ubers immediately, their phones glowing in their hands like little lights of escape. Aria had checked her bank account, $5.23. Not enough. So she had started walking, her ankle still strong then, her hope still holding, because there was a nanny position in Henderson and maybe, just maybe, this lead would not be another dead end like all the others. But the storm came too fast. The sky had darkened without warning. The first drops fell, then the deluge, and within minutes the highway had become a river of wind and noise and desperation. She thought of her mother. She always thought of her mother when things got worst. 72 years old now, lying in a bed at Sunset Care Facility in Arizona, her body slowly shutting down, cell by cell, day by day. The experimental treatment cost $35,000. Insurance would not cover it. The clinic had given her a deadline, 3 days. After that, her mother would go on the waiting list, which meant no treatment at all. It meant watching her fade. Aria had been saving for 2 years. She had $215 to show for it. She had lost the only income she had. She did not know how she would find $35,000 in 3 days, or 3 months, or 3 years. The headlights appeared first as a glow in the rain ahead, then as three distinct shapes moving in formation. Not single cars. A convoy. Black SUVs, luxury grade, moving in perfect alignment down the highway. They were traveling too slow for the weather. Too deliberate. The first SUV slowed as it approached her. Then stopped. Doors opened. A tall man emerged from the second vehicle, his dark suit soaked immediately in the downpour. He moved with the kind of control that suggested he did not care about the rain, about his suit, about anything except the person sitting on the gravel in front of him. Behind him came two more men, broader, harder-faced, with the particular stillness of people trained in violence. The tall man stepped closer. She knew his face. She had seen him that morning in the marble foyer of the Blackwell estate, standing silent while Evelyn had screamed accusations and her own life had collapsed into a single lie. Aleandro Caruso. She did not know his name then. She only knew that he had watched her with an intensity that had made her feel seen in a way that terrified her. "Miss Reynolds," he said. His voice was deep and solid like an oath, unmoved by the thunder rolling overhead. She stared at him, confused, rain streaming down her face. "How do you?" "Get in the car." Not a question. A directive. The kind of statement that expected obedience. "I don't even know who you are." The taller of the two men beside him started forward with an umbrella, but Aleandro raised a hand to stop him. Then he did something that no wealthy man in $1,000 suit should have done. He knelt on the wet gravel beside her, his expensive fabric soaking through instantly, meeting her eyes at her level. "Someone who doesn't leave people to drown," he said quietly. She hesitated, every survival instinct screaming at her to refuse help from strangers, from men in dark suits, from someone who arrived in a convoy like he owned the earth. But her ankle was screaming. The rain was turning her vision blurry. And she was so tired of drowning alone. He helped her to her feet. His grip was strong but careful, and she leaned against him as he guided her to the open door of the middle SUV. The interior was warm, leather seats that felt like clouds, a temperature that made her realize just how cold the rain had made her. She was shivering so violently that her teeth chattered. One of his men, Bruno, she would learn his name was Bruno, handed her a blanket. Cashmere, probably. Worth more than her monthly rent. Aleandro was already on his phone before the doors closed. "Bruno, take us to the safe house. Call Dr. Chen. We'll need immediate treatment for lacerations and possible fracture." "I can't pay for a doctor," Aria said through chattering teeth. "I can't pay for any of this. I have $5. "I'm not asking you to pay," Aleandro said, and something in his voice made it clear that this was not a negotiation. This was a man accustomed to having his will become reality. The convoy pulled away from the highway. Through the rear window, Aria watched the storm receding, the rain streaking diagonally across the glass. Aleandro sat across from her, studying her face with an intensity that felt like being examined under a microscope. His dark eyes were impossible to read. His jaw was tight. She did not know that in that moment, watching her shiver beneath a cashmere blanket, Aleandro Caruso was seeing someone he had lost a long time ago. He did not know it either. But his men saw something shift in his chest, something they had never seen in 15 years of loyalty. Bruno and Luca exchanged a look that suggested they understood something had broken open in their boss, something quiet and dangerous and completely irreversible. The penthouse safe house was on the 42nd floor of a building with no name on the directory. The elevator opened directly into the space. Floor-to-ceiling windows revealed the Las Vegas sprawl below, the rain still hammering against the glass, the city lights blurring into watercolor streaks. The interior was all cream and steel and minimalist furniture that probably cost more than Aria's entire life added together. Dr. Chen arrived within 40 minutes. She was a woman in her 60s with silver hair pulled back in a severe bun and hands that were gentle as she cleaned Aria's scraped palms and wrapped her twisted ankle. While she worked, Bruno and Luca brought her dry clothes, cashmere pants, a silk shirt, a sweater so soft it felt like being touched by clouds. She had never worn anything like it. In the guest bathroom, she caught her reflection. Her face was swollen from crying and rain. Her hair hung in wet ropes. She looked like someone who had been drowning. When she emerged, Aleandro was waiting in the main room. He sat in an armchair, perfectly still, his own clothes changed to fresh ones, his dark hair damp. His men stood by the doors like sentries. "Tell me what happened this morning," he said. "All of it." Something about his stillness, about the way he waited with absolute patience, made her talk. She told him about 3 years working for the Blackwell family, about sleeping in a converted closet, about 14-hour days and minimum wage and a child she loved more than she loved breathing. She told him about Evelyn, the second wife, who hated her because Emma loved her more. She told him about this morning, about the bracelet planted in her room, about being called a thief in front of the man who had employed her since she was 22 years old. He did not interrupt. He did not move. "Why do you need $35,000 in 3 days?" he asked finally. The question broke something in her. Her voice came out in pieces. "My mother. She's sick. In Arizona. The treatment costs exactly $35,000. If we don't pay by Friday, they take her off the list. There's no other treatment. There's no other option. So she just stops." Aleandro was silent for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice was different. Older somehow. "I'll cover it." Aria stared. "What?" $35,000 for your mother's treatment. "I'll wire it tonight." "No." She stood, her ankle screaming. She sat back down. "No, I can't accept that. Why would you? I don't even know you. I have nothing to offer. I can't pay you back. I'm nobody." "I have?" "You're not nobody," he said, and Bruno and Luca exchanged the kind of glance that suggested they were witnessing something unprecedented. In 15 years, they had never heard their boss speak to anyone like this. "And I'm not asking you to pay it back." "Then what do you want from me?" His jaw tightened. "I want you safe. That's all." But what Aria could not have known was that Aleandro Caruso's own mother had died from an illness when he was 16, before he had built his empire, before he had learned to turn tragedy into power. She had died because they did not have the money. And he had spent the last 26 years carrying the weight of that helplessness in his chest like a stone. The phone rang. Bruno answered, his face darkening immediately. He handed it to Aleandro without speaking. When Aleandro hung up, he turned to Luca. "Douglas Hale is recruiting again. East Corridor." Aria watched, confused. "Who's Douglas Hale?" Bruno's expression was careful. "There's a man in this city who preys on desperate women. Promises them jobs, housing, hope. Then traps them. Sells them. He has networks across 3 states." The room tilted. Aleandro's eyes locked onto hers. "What were you planning to do in Henderson?" With trembling hands, she pulled out her phone and showed him the job posting. The nanny position. The address. The phone number. Bruno took the phone, made a call, listened. When he looked up, his face had turned to stone. "It's one of his recruitment lines," he said quietly. She would have walked straight into a trap. She would have answered that phone and heard a voice promising safety, and it would have been a lie that led to chains. Aleandro made 3 calls in rapid succession, his voice changing to something cold and lethal. "I want surveillance on every phone line. I want his locations. I want his schedule. I want to know where his victims are being held." He hung up. Turned to Aria. "You're staying here tonight. Tomorrow we find you a real job and a real apartment. But tonight, you don't leave my sight." She wanted to argue, but her body had begun to understand something her mind was still refusing. She was no longer alone. That night, lying in the guest bed, the softest bed she had ever felt, Aria stared at the ceiling and thought about her mother, about Emma, about the $35,000 that would arrive in her account by morning. She thought about a man in a dark suit who had knelt in the rain beside her and asked for nothing in return except that she stay safe. She did not know that Douglas Hale had added her name to his list of targets. She did not know that even now, he was watching the penthouse, waiting for her to leave alone. She did not know that Aleandro's men were watching Hale back, waiting for him to make a move. What changed everything was already in motion. The parking garage was silent except for the sound of her footsteps echoing off concrete, each step a small prayer that her car would start. Aria Reynolds had made it through another shift at the country club, had smiled through the insults, had bitten her tongue when Mrs. Blackwell called her the help in front of her friends. Now, at 11:56 at night, with only $5 in her pocket and 12 days before the eviction notice on her apartment became real, all she wanted was to disappear into her apartment and sleep. The footsteps behind her came without warning. She heard them before she understood what they meant, the measured pace of someone who knew exactly where they were going. Aria turned. The man approaching was in his early 40s, wearing a suit that cost more than 3 months of her rent, his face arranged into something that looked like a smile but felt like a blade. 2 other men flanked him, their shoulders wide as doorways, their eyes empty of anything resembling mercy. "Aria Reynolds," the man said. His voice was smooth as silk and twice as dangerous. "You're a hard woman to get alone." She stepped backward, her keys already in her hand, her car 30 feet away and impossibly far. "I don't know you." "But I know you," he continued, closing the distance between them. "You answered my advertisement. The position in Henderson. You were supposed to come work for me. And then you disappeared into Aleandro Caruso's protection." Her blood froze. This was Douglas Hale. She understood it the way a small animal understands the shadow of a hawk. "I found another job," she whispered. "I'm sure you did." He stepped closer. "But you see, Aria, when someone tells me they're coming to work for me and then vanishes, that becomes a problem. A problem I need to solve. And I always solve my problems." She ran. The concrete echoed with the chaos of pursuit, her breath coming in ragged gasps, her shoes slapping the ground in a rhythm of pure panic. Behind her, their footsteps were unhurried, almost casual. They were not worried about catching her. They knew she had nowhere to go. Her car was 20 feet away. 10. She fumbled with the door, got it open, threw herself inside and locked it. Her hand shook so violently she could barely get the key in the ignition. The engine turned over. She was pressing the accelerator when the window exploded. Glass showered across the passenger seat. Hands reached through, fingers closing around her throat, pulling her backward. She fought with the desperation of someone who finally understood that hope was a luxury she could not afford. Her fingernails found his face and she scratched with everything she had, heard him howl, but his grip only tightened. "You cost me," he hissed, his voice transforming into something barely human. "You cost me time. You cost me money. Now you're going to work off that debt." Her vision tunneled. Black spots bloomed at the edges. Her lungs screamed for air that would not come. This was how it ended. Not with some distant villain, but here, in a parking garage, with no one knowing her name except as a statistic. Then the world erupted. Black SUVs flooded the garage like a plague of locusts, tires screaming against concrete, doors opening before they had fully stopped. Men in dark suits emerged, moving with the absolute precision of those who had rehearsed this exact moment. And between them walked a figure who seemed to move through the chaos like it parted for him automatically. Aleandro Caruso. He was 6 feet 2 inches tall, with dark hair silvered at the temples and eyes the color of a winter storm. His suit was Italian wool, his watch was solid gold, and when he looked at Douglas Hale, something in Hale's face simply broke. The hands around Aria's throat released immediately. Hale tried to run. He did not make it 3 steps before Bruno and Luca brought him down, his expensive suit now pressed against the concrete, his face discovering what consequence felt like. Aleandro went directly to Aria. He knelt beside her in the wreckage of her car window, his hand steady and careful as it touched her shoulder. "I've got you," he said, and his voice was exactly like thunder, like something that could shake the earth. "I've got you now." She was shaking so violently she could not feel her own limbs. Blood ran from her split lip onto his white shirt. His hands were gentle as he lifted her, cradling her against his chest like she weighed nothing at all, like she was something precious instead of a barely employed maid who had almost gotten herself killed. He carried her to the SUV. Over his shoulder, his voice changed into something lethal and cold. "Hold him. I want everything, every location, every victim, every name in his network. I want his phone records, his financial statements, his supplier contacts. Then call the FBI and tell them Agent Morrison that I have a gift for them." Bruno smiled, but there was no kindness in it. "With pleasure, boss." Inside the vehicle, Dr. Chen was already waiting, her medical bag open on the seat beside her. She began treating Aria's injuries with the efficiency of someone who had done this many times before. An ice pack for the swelling around her eye. Antiseptic for the cut on her lip. Careful hands checking her throat for serious damage, clicking her tongue at the handprints already blooming purple and black. Outside, rain began to fall. It came down in sheets, the way summer storms did in Las Vegas, sudden and violent and absolute. Aria sat wrapped in a blanket that smelled like expensive cologne and safety, watching the rain streak down the window. Her reflection looked back at her, a stranger with a bruised face and broken eyes. Something was breaking inside her. Not her ribs or her bones, but something deeper. Some final fragment of hope she had been holding onto. The belief that if she just worked hard enough, just kept her head down long enough, eventually the universe would let her breathe. Instead, the universe had sent Douglas Hale. She reached for the door handle. She could leave. She could disappear into the rain like she was never here, stop bringing disaster into this man's life, stop being the broken thing that attracted the broken things. Evelyn Blackwell had been right. She was nothing. A maid. A woman so invisible that men like Douglas Hale thought they could simply reach out and take her. Her fingers closed around the handle. Through the rain-streaked window, she saw Aleandro standing in the downpour. He was soaked through, his expensive suit clinging to his body like wet skin, his phone pressed to his ear. He was coordinating something, she could hear his voice, low and steady, giving orders in Italian. And then, in the middle of a sentence, he looked back at the SUV. He looked at her. Just checked. Just for a moment. Just to make sure she was still there. The look on his face was not pity. It was not possession. It was something worse and better and far more dangerous than either of those things. It was fear. Real, raw fear that she would disappear. That she would open that door and walk into the rain and vanish from his life as suddenly as she had entered it. And Aria Reynolds understood, in that moment, that she was not nothing. Not to him. She released the door handle. 2 days later, Aria sat in a hospital room while her mother slept in the bed beside her. The treatment was working. The doctors had said so, their faces finally arranged into something resembling hope instead of resignation. Her mother's hand was in hers, thin and fragile as paper, but warm. Alive. Still here. The television mounted on the wall was showing the news. Federal agents in tactical gear moved through a warehouse, leading out 17 women who squinted at the sunlight like they were seeing it for the first time in their lives. Douglas Hale was being escorted from the courthouse in handcuffs, his face contorted with rage and disbelief. He was screaming about conspiracy, about violations of his rights, about the injustice of it all. The news anchor's voice was clinical. Douglas Hale, 47, was arrested on charges including human trafficking, conspiracy, kidnapping, and racketeering. Federal prosecutors are recommending a sentence of 40 years without the possibility of parole. The camera cut to Agent Morrison outside the courthouse. We could not have built this case without the cooperation of private investigators who brought us substantial evidence. This man preyed on vulnerable women. That predation ends today. Meanwhile, in another part of the city, Evelyn Blackwell was being led from her country club in handcuffs. The arrest happened at 2:15 on a Thursday afternoon, during her weekly luncheon with her society friends. FBI agents approached her at the table, and for a moment, Aria could see on Evelyn's face that she believed this was some kind of mistake, some misunderstanding that her money and connections would immediately resolve. It did not. The charges were fraud, embezzlement, and theft. The evidence was irrefutable. She had been systematically draining her husband's accounts for 3 years, forging his signature on documents, planning to disappear with nearly $2 million. And when her accomplice, a lawyer named Marcus Webb, was arrested separately, he immediately provided records of every transaction. Her society friends watched her leave in handcuffs, their faces carefully arranged into expressions of shock that seemed more performative than genuine. By the next day, none of them would return her calls. Mr. Blackwell filed for divorce that same afternoon. He did not contest custody of Emma. He simply took his daughter by the hand and began the work of becoming a father instead of just a man who provided a home. Emma, age 6, had drawn a picture for her mother during one of the visits. It was crayon on paper, a stick figure with a yellow dress and a smile. Under it, in careful letters that Aria had helped her form, it said, "Colors for Sad Days." The social worker had taken it as evidence. Aria watched from Aleandro's penthouse as the news coverage continued, as reporters stood outside the courthouse, as the weight of consequence finally settled onto people who had believed themselves beyond such things. She sat on the balcony overlooking the Las Vegas Strip, the city lights beginning to glow in the darkening evening, and she felt something she had not felt in years. Relief. Aleandro found her there as the sun descended below the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and gold. He sat beside her without speaking, his presence a kind of answer to questions she had not yet learned how to ask. "Why did you do all of this?" she said finally, her voice still rough from the bruising around her throat. "For me?" "Because you mattered," he answered, and there was something in his voice that suggested this was not a small thing to him, that being mattered to was not something that happened in his world very often. The rain came that night, another summer storm, but she was not afraid of the rain anymore. She was inside. She was safe. She was, for the first time in her entire life, not alone. Family is not always bound by blood but by those who choose to stay when the storm arrives. The autumn light came slanting through the office windows of the Reynolds Foundation, touching Aria's face as she reviewed the quarterly fundraising numbers. $12,000. Then $23,000. Then $38,000. Her hands trembled slightly as she scrolled through the spreadsheet, each number a small miracle she had built from nothing but determination and a belief that invisible people deserved to be seen. The foundation occupied the 3rd floor of a renovated building in downtown Las Vegas, far from the penthouse districts and the casinos, but close to the neighborhoods where women like her lived. Women counting dollars until the 20th of the month. Women choosing between medicine and electricity. Women whose children wore hand-me-downs and whose hands bore the calluses of work that never ended. She had started with a single donation from Aleandro, $50,000, transferred without explanation, without expectation. She had tried to refuse it. He had looked at her with those storm-dark eyes and said only, "Use it the way you wish." By month 2, she had tripled it. By month 3, she was managing funds from 17 different donors, each one referred to her by people who understood what it meant to be forgotten. The office door opened without knocking. Luca entered, carrying 2 coffee cups, setting one beside her keyboard. He was a large man, shoulders that filled doorways, a scar running from his left temple to his jaw, the kind of scar that told stories Aria had learned not to ask about. He wore a charcoal suit that probably cost more than she used to earn in a month, and he moved with the careful attention of someone trained to notice everything. "Boss says you need to eat," Luca said in a voice like gravel. "You've been here since 6 in the morning." "The boss doesn't need to worry about my schedule," Aria replied, but she was smiling. She had learned that Aleandro's concern was not ownership. It was something quieter and more dangerous, something that had grown over 3 months like a plant reaching toward light. Luca snorted. "Tell him that yourself." He set a small box on her desk. Inside was a croissant, still warm, from the bakery 3 blocks away. The same bakery where she used to stand outside the window at 7 in the morning, watching other people eat breakfast. Bruno's waiting downstairs with the car. You have the Riverside Women's Center presentation at 2. After he left, Aria sat with the coffee cooling in her hands. 2 sugars, cream. The exact way she liked it. She had never told Aleandro how she took her coffee. The presentation went precisely as she had planned. 22 women in a community center, fluorescent lights humming overhead, the smell of industrial floor cleaner mixing with hope. Aria stood before them in the black dress she had bought with her first paycheck from the foundation, modest, elegant, purchased by her own hands. She showed them the numbers. 43 families lifted out of emergency housing. 12 children now in school full-time instead of working. 6 women in job training programs. 3 months ago, I was standing where you are, Aria said, her voice steady. I had $5 in my pocket. I had an eviction notice taped to my door. I had no idea how I would feed myself 1 week forward. She paused, let the silence settle. I thought I was invisible. I thought my situation was my fault, and my silence was my punishment. But then something changed. Someone saw me. Not as a victim. As a person capable of rebuilding her own life. One woman's hand went up. Young, maybe 25, with the kind of exhaustion that came from double shifts and no sleep. How did you do it? Specifically. What was the first thing you did? Aria's chest tightened. She thought of the morning Aleandro's convoy found her in the rain. She thought of the garage, the blood, the choice to believe she was worth saving. She thought of the 3 months since, each day a small negotiation with fear. The first thing I did, Aria said, was accept that I did not have to do it alone. And the second thing was never forgetting what that felt like, being alone, being invisible. So I built something to make sure no one else had to feel that way. She looked directly at the woman. You are not invisible. You matter. And if you want help, I am here. Aleandro was waiting when she left the community center. His black SUV idled at the curb, Bruno behind the wheel, the engine purring like a predator at rest. Aleandro sat in the back seat, reading something on his phone, but he looked up the moment she opened the door. He always did. In 3 months, she had never once seen him distracted when she entered a room. How was it? He asked as she settled beside him. I registered 12 new clients, she said. And I raised a commitment for another $15,000 from the Riverside Foundation Board. Their director wants to meet with you. Aleandro set down his phone. Tell them yes. But the meeting goes through you. You are the director. My involvement is background. It was not a small thing he was offering. His name meant money in Las Vegas. His endorsement could raise millions. But he was giving her the visible role. The authority. The credit. This too was something Aria had learned about him. He wielded power, but he gave agency. The drive took them through the city as afternoon light began its descent. Bruno navigated the streets with the precision of someone who had made this route 1,000 times. Aleandro and Aria sat in comfortable silence, the kind that took months to build, the kind that meant words were no longer necessary for understanding. There is something I want to show you, Aleandro said as they approached her apartment building. Before you go inside. Her stomach tightened. In 3 months, these invitations had become the moment she both feared and craved. Small moments where the boundary between gratitude and feeling threatened to become something neither of them could control. He led her to the penthouse instead. The elevator climbed 40 stories, and Aria's heart climbed with it. The doors opened onto a space she had been to exactly twice, the second time being the night she had watched the news coverage of Hale's arrest, surrounded by light and glass and the terrible weight of consequence finally settling on people who had believed themselves beyond it. But tonight, the penthouse was different. The kitchen glowed with warmth. A table was set for 2, white cloth, candles, the smell of something Italian, garlic, tomato, basil, the kind of smell that meant home to people who came from nothing. Aleandro, she began. Not here, he said quietly. Not tonight. Tonight we go to Caruso's. I have a table. He watched her face carefully, reading the flush in her cheeks, the sudden shallowness of her breathing. If you want to. The restaurant was old money and careful violence, the kind of place where the waiters knew everyone by their first name and the private booths in the back never asked questions. Aleandro had reserved the booth in the far corner, set back from the main floor, where the light from the candles was soft enough to be kind and the red leather seat seemed to swallow sound. Aria had never been to a place like this. She had never ordered wine she did not recognize or eaten pasta that tasted like someone had spent hours building flavor from nothing. She had never sat across from someone who watched her the way Aleandro watched her, like she was a question he needed answered, a puzzle he wanted to spend the rest of his life solving. They ordered. They ate. They talked about the foundation, about Emma's latest drawings, about the way her mother's voice had sounded stronger in their last phone call from Arizona. The conversation moved like water, finding its own paths, deepening in some places and running shallow in others. Over tiramisu and espresso, Aleandro set down his cup with the kind of finality that meant what came next was important. I need to tell you something, he said. Aria's heart stopped its careful rhythm and began to thunder. She watched his hands on the white tablecloth. Hands that had ordered terrible things. Hands that had also held Emma on a swing. Hands that, 3 months ago, had kept her from dying in a garage. When I saw you that first morning, he continued, his voice lower now, at the Blackwell estate, being accused of something you did not do, standing there with nothing but your dignity, I saw my mother. He paused, and something in his face shifted. The kind of shift that suggested old wounds being reopened. She was a maid too. Worked for a family that treated her like furniture. When she got sick, they fired her. No insurance. No severance. Nothing. I was 16 years old. I held her hand while she died and I swore I would never be helpless again. His voice had become something else entirely, not the measured tone of a man accustomed to command, but something raw and unfinished. And then 30 years later, I see you in that foyer and it is like God is giving me a second chance. A chance to be the person I needed to be when I was 16. Someone who could stop the bleeding. Someone who could say, not this time. Not on my watch. Aria's eyes were burning. She reached across the table and took both his hands. I need you to know something too, she said, her voice trembling like a candle in wind. For 3 months, you have protected me. You have helped me rebuild my life. You have given me space to become myself again. You have never made me feel owned or obligated or like I owe you anything. You have just stayed. Always, he said. I know. She squeezed his hands. That is the terrifying part. I am not afraid of Hale anymore. I am not afraid of being alone. But I am terrified of this, of what I feel for you, of what it means, of losing it. He stood and came around the table. For a moment she thought he was leaving. Instead, he knelt beside the booth, both knees on the polished floor. Not a proposal. Just equality. Just a man asking permission instead of demanding it. I am asking you to let me love you, he said. Not as someone who saved you. Not as someone you owe anything to. But as a man who wants to build a life with a woman he admires more than anyone he has ever met. Around them, the restaurant had gone quiet. Other patrons, waiters, everyone watching the feared Aleandro Caruso kneel beside a woman in a simple black dress like she was made of light and miracle. She pulled him up into the booth beside her and kissed him. Soft at first, then desperate, then tender. When they broke apart, foreheads touching, she whispered the only word that mattered. Yes. 6 months later, the eviction notice was framed on the wall of their shared apartment. Aria had insisted on keeping it. Aleandro did not understand until she explained. It was the moment everything changed. The moment the rain stopped being punishment and became something that could be weathered. The foundation now operated in 3 cities. Emma spent weekends with them, teaching Aleandro how to braid hair, teaching him that being powerful meant something entirely different when there was a 6-year-old watching you learn. Her mother had arrived from Arizona, healthy, hugging Aleandro and calling him son. Family is not always bound by blood but by those who choose to stay when the storm arrives. And Aria Reynolds, who once had $5 to her name, who stood invisible in foyers and counted pennies like prayers, she stood now in rooms full of light, and she was no longer counting. She was building. She was home. If this story moved you, hit that like button and share it with someone who needs to hear it. Subscribe to this channel for more stories about love, redemption, and the families we choose. Drop a comment telling us, who is someone who stayed for you when the storm arrived? We will see you in the next story. Until then, remember, you are never as invisible as you think, and you are never as alone as you fear. Thank you for staying with us until the very end. We wish you good health, a joyful life, and days filled with peace and happiness. Goodbye, and we will see you again in the next video.